Okay, so welcome. My name is Amy Bell and I'm the artist development producer at The Place. My sign name is like this, like a jangling bell. And I'm really excited to be welcoming you to this Feed Your Practice webinar on navigating Brexit. We are joined today by the fantastic Axel Satgé and Wratten, who are Split Second. And I'm just going to bring them on and let them introduce themselves. So here they are. Hi Axel, and hi Kevin. How are you doing?
All good, thanks. All good. Yep, happy to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
Good one. I wanted to invite Kevin and Axel because they really have done incredible amounts of work on the Brexit issue of how to handle it as artists and producers, and also because they're really committed to this being a kind of peer learning moment for all of us, where no one has all the answers, but we can come together to try to share what we know and what we'd like to know. So yeah, really excited that we'll spend about the next hour or so together with Kevin and Axel. So without further ado, I'll let you take it away.
Lovely, thanks again. Hi, my name's Kevin. My pronouns are he and him. I've got dark brown hair. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses and an orange shirt.
Hey, hi everyone, my name is Axel. My pronouns are he and him. I have dark brown hair, blue eyes, and a bit of a stubble. And I'm wearing a white t-shirt.
And together we are the co-founders and directors of Split Second. So we formed Split Second at the start of lockdown last year, when we were both independent producers trying to navigate all this uncertainty around COVID and then the kind of ongoing challenges of trying to understand Brexit. So we decided we were stronger together to form Split Second. And as Split Second, we are producing and touring a portfolio of artists who are working across circus, dance and theatre, indoors and outdoors. We're also creating projects to support the development of artists and producers. So looking at training, looking at surgeries, looking at one-to-one mentoring, etc. And we work to strengthen the sector through consultation, research, and being an active voice in international networks. And that includes some of the research we've been doing with XTRAX around Brexit and navigating these new challenges.
And we've been invited here today because we gathered along the way some Brexit expertise. In our everyday professional life, both Kevin and I work with British companies touring internationally. So we have faced some of the Brexit challenges. But most importantly, we have collaborated with XTRAX to produce a practical guide to Brexit for outdoor arts touring companies. So for those of you who don't know XTRAX, XTRAX is a sort of development agency for outdoor arts in the UK, and they're based in Manchester. And I think we have at least one XTRAX member here with us today. And yes, and also we did a similar webinar actually a few weeks ago, where we invited a few guests to talk to us about some of the stickier points about Brexit. So we're here today to share with you our knowledge, I guess. And I'm going to start sharing the screen.
So just as we share the screen, just to say that you should be able to hopefully move the bar across that divides the screen share and the speakers. So if you want to alter the size of Kevin, Axel and Stacey, you should be able to do that. But let me know if you've got any problems with that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, so just to start with an outline of how we're structuring today. We've split our presentation into two main sections. The first will be looking at outward mobility. So that's looking at UK artists or companies who are touring to present work in Europe or working for European companies. In that section, we're going to look at considerations for moving people, moving goods, or in our sector, set equipment, and we'll look at a case study from a UK company who was preparing to tour in Europe. The second section will look at inward mobility, so European artists touring to the UK with their own work or coming to work with UK companies or festivals. So we'll look at the same considerations around moving people, moving stuff, and we'll look at a case study from Gandini Juggling, who are a UK-based company who are often working with European artists to perform in the UK. Oh, sorry, then we'll share a list. That's the bulk of it. We'll share a list of resources, and then we obviously go into a question and answer session where we can get to the nitty gritty of some of what we've introduced.
Thank you, Kevin. So yes, our first section will be on outward mobility. So taking shows from the UK into the EU. And we're going to cover the questions that you see on your screen now. So what has changed now that the UK has left the EU? How can artists still travel and work in the EU? What changes for transport of set and equipment, and what we don't know yet. So I'm going to give a very brief answer to the first question. What has changed now that the UK has left the EU? So if you've looked around a little bit on information on Brexit, the key thing that always comes back is now that the UK is a third country for the EU. So what that means in essence is that EU will treat the UK as any other country outside of the EU. So we get the same rights as let's say America or anywhere outside of the EU. So that has a lot of implications. Obviously, you all know about no more freedom of movement of people and goods between the UK and the EU. And there's a lot of other implications that we're going to cover now. Over to you, Kevin.
So yeah, let's look at the first question. How can UK artists still travel and work in the EU? So I think around this, there's a few key questions and considerations just to make sure that you've got the right paperwork in place. The first question being, have you got the right travel documents? So if you're traveling with a British passport, on the day of travel, your passport needs to have at least 6 months left before it expires so that you can travel. And it needs to be be less than 10 years old. And if you don't have either of those or meet those requirements, you may not be able to enter into European countries. So I think before you even get to thinking about traveling, check your travel document. Is it 6 months left before expiring, and has it been issued within the past 10 years? The next consideration is around meeting entry requirements. And there's two key considerations here: visas and work permits. And it's important to flag that some countries refer to these documents interchangeably. So it's just really important to consider this when you're doing your research and just be clarifying what visa means, what work permit means for each country. Each individually, the visa is a document that gives a person
I think Kevin froze.
the right to enter or leave the country
Kevin,
as UK nationals sport, which is, yeah.
Kevin, I think you froze
Hello?
for a second.
Oh, sorry. Did you hear my overview of visa?
Can you start again just to be safe?
Sure. So yes, so I'm going to look at visas and work permits separately, just so that we understand what the purpose of each document is and what it permits you to do. So the visa is a document which gives the person the right to enter or leave a country for which it was issued. And as UK nationals holding a British passport, we have up to 90 days within a period of 180 days to enter into the Schengen area under a visa waiver regime. So that means within a 6-month period, we can enter visa-free for up to 90 days. That could be consecutive days, or it could be a month here, a weekend there, 3 weeks there. but ultimately those days are looked at in a kind of they backtrack 6 months essentially to look at how many days you've spent in the Schengen area. So as UK nationals, we can be in there for up to 90 days within 180 days. However, if we're seeking work in the EU, UK nationals are considered third country nationals, and we might need a visa and or a work permit to do so. And the rules are determined by each member state. So it's important to be checking in with each EU country to which you hope to travel to. So that's visa, which is mainly about right to enter and be in the country. The second consideration.
Let's just swap over interpreters while we move on to the next consideration. Thanks. Let's do that. Thanks very much.
Hi, Aaron. So the second consideration is around work permits. So the work permit is legal authorization, which allows someone to take up employment in a country. So as UK nationals, if we're seeking to work in the EU, again, we're considered third country nationals. That's something that we'll be repeating throughout today. And we may need a work permit to do so. What's complicated here is that each member state of the EU sets the rules around work permits and or visas. So again, it's just really important to be researching what the terms are and the regulations are for all of the European countries that you're hoping to tour to. So just to look at a few EU state members as examples, if you were trying to travel tour or show to Germany, in terms of visa, as a British passport holder, you're not required to have a visa if you staying for under 90 days. And then in terms of work permit, as an artist, you're exempt from applying for a work permit as long as it's within 90 days every 12-month rolling period. So, so not quite the 90 within 180 days. Their work permit exemption is if you're working no more than 90 days within a 12-month period. So just a consideration, it's a kind of particular requirement to meet. In terms of the Netherlands, if you were trying to tour to the Netherlands, no visa is required for paid activity. But in terms of work permits, as long as you're there for a one-off short-term engagement, so less than 6 weeks, you should be exempt from needing a work permit. So again, different circumstances to Germany, but quite clear in terms of visas and work permits. Somewhere like Latvia, all paid work requires a visa, no matter the length of stay. And in terms of permits, you'll need one to work in Latvia as well. And that would generally be organized through the Latvian presentation partner that you're working with. So as I said, each state determines their own rules and regulations around visas and work permits. So in terms of where to check, obviously check in with individual embassies, but Arts Admin have also recently published a really helpful guide around EU touring post-Brexit. And part of that guide is a kind of country by country guide of what's required in terms of visas and work permits. So this is part of a resource list that will be circulated, and I've seen Amy's just dropped that into the chat. So I'd really encourage you to look into that as well.
Thanks, Kevin. So the other thing that we need to think about when we take work to Europe is social security, insurance, healthcare, sorry. So obviously there's a lot of changes now. So up to pre-Brexit, British citizens used to be able to be covered for medical emergency when they were going to Europe. For a brief moment of time, we thought that we'd lost this right, but actually there's been a change of regulation since Brexit, and British citizens still have access to emergency medical care when they go to Europe. So to benefit from that, you need to get, let me check my notes, a global health insurance card, also called GHIC. Which replaces the European Health Insurance Card, EHIC. So it's basically the same thing, but you need to apply for this new card. If you have an old card, it's still valid until it expires, but you really need to think about getting a new card. A note on that, for the EU citizens residents in the UK, they can still use their European cards, and once it expires, they can apply for a European card. They don't need to get a British card. But this GHIC card only gives you rights to get healthcare in a certain country. That doesn't replace your travel insurance. So you should definitely look into getting travel insurance suitable to your needs when you travel to Europe. The other thing we're going to look at now is social security payments. For some time, I guess if you've already taken work to Europe, you know that you need to provide a document called A1, which is a document that proves to the visiting country that you pay your taxes and your social security contributions in the UK. And at some point, we were hoping as producers that with Brexit, we wouldn't have to provide those documents again, because if you've already tried to get those documents, they're really annoying. But actually, that doesn't change. So if you take work to Europe, you still need to provide A1. If you don't know how that system works, again, you can look into the Brexit guides that we put together for XTRAX. There's some explanation and some links to explain you where to get it.
Brilliant. So moving on to the next point, what changes for the transport of sets and equipment? So this really hinges on the scale that you're working to. So essentially, what are you traveling with? How much stuff and how are you traveling? So if, for example, you're traveling with carry-on luggage only, so costumes, props, equipment or whatever that fits within suitcases, there's no real difference. If your equipment fits in, you can travel with that as regular carry-on luggage, and you don't need what's referred to as a carnet that we'll talk about in just a second. However, if you are touring with carry-on luggage and you're traveling with, bulk items or something that looks like it could be being imported for commercial use or to sell and make profit from, you might consider doing a carnet even for carry-on luggage. So for example, if you were touring with a show with 50 headphones and MP3s, it may look like you're taking them into the country to sell, in which case the carnet would let you take them in and track that you've brought them all out, that you've not sold, imported for sale, for example, any items. So in general, traveling with carry-on luggage, if it sets props or costumes, is generally fine. If, however, you're traveling with a vehicle, so this could be either a vehicle you're driving yourself, or if you're using a courier service, you will need to apply for what's called a carnet, which is an international customs and temporary export-import document. And basically, the purpose of the carnet is to list, quite detailed breakdown of what you're traveling with, what it's worth, and it gets stamped to say that it's entered into the EU country. And then equally, as you leave back into the UK, it's also checked and stamped to basically say that everything that's went into the EU has came back to the UK, which prevents you having to pay any customs duty or tax for imported or exported items. Applying for a carnet is quite a detailed process, and it's broken down in a lot of detail in some of the resources that we'll refer to a bit later on. The XTRAX guide, one of the focal point labs that we ran, a production manager gave a great breakdown of producing these documents, where to go, how much it costs, how to manage them. And equally, gov.uk has a really clear outline of how they work, how to use them, and how to apply for one. So that's a good place to find out some more information about the carnets. Pre-Brexit, we didn't need carnets to travel with set in couriers or in vans to the EU, but you may have already been doing these to go to further afield, for example, US touring or Canada touring. Another consideration around how you're moving your equipment: if you're driving with your own vehicle, your vehicle will need a GB, a Great Britain sticker on your number plate. Some number plates have them, some don't, in which case you'll need to source a GB sticker. And you'll also need a green card, which is a proof of vehicle insurance when you're driving abroad. So basically that says, as a UK driver, you have insurance to be driving in the EU. One other consideration, again, which is determined EU state by state, is you may need an international driving permit to be driving in the EU. Check with the embassy of the country that you're traveling to. It's a simple document to arrange through your post office, but it may be legally required in order to legally drive in some EU countries.
Thanks, Kevin. The next thing to consider when taking equipment abroad is cabotage. It's one of the new words I've learned thanks to Brexit. I never thought about cabotage before. So cabotage is, in a sense, when you take your set of equipment to more than one country inside the EU. So you make different stops, go to different countries. So until Brexit, you could, of course, take your set and travel around EU without thinking too much about it, and go from Spain to France to Italy to Poland back to the UK. Unfortunately, it's a lot more complicated now. With the new rules, you can only make 3 stops inside the EU before you need to go back to the UK. So what that means is, so if you're based in England, you first have to go to France to cross, to go to Spain for your first performance. Then you go to Italy. Then in theory, you should go back to the UK and start again. So that makes the logistics of touring extremely complicated. In the guides, we talked to artists who have already suggested a few ways around that. And I know that there's a lot of changes happening at the moment to make life a little bit easier. So some UK freight companies have already set up offices in the EU. So it means that you take your sets with the UK company to, let's say, Brussels, and then the same company, but under EU hats, will take it from there. So that's a lot easier. But you need to think about all of that, all that extra logistics, all the extra time that it may take as well to cross borders and to organize that changeover of freight companies. The next thing that's might not be so relevant for the arts, but just in case, there's the transport of merchandise. So that's for when you want to sell goods. I guess that can apply to some of us if we want to sell evening programs after a show, or if we want to sell, I don't know, t-shirts or any goodies after a show. So if you want to do that, in theory, you should get what's called an EORI number. So that stands for Economic Operators Registration and Identification Number. So that's an international number that's free to get. You get it through HMRC, but that gives you a license to basically sell your things abroad. And obviously, you will need to pay taxes on the things that you are selling. Just a little tip on that we've heard from some companies. So Kevin was talking about carnet earlier. In theory, you shouldn't be able to include your merchandise into the carnet, because the carnet is really for exactly what leaves and what comes back to the country. So if you intend to sell some of that stuff, it won't appear on the carnet on the way back. But some companies have managed to put together all their t-shirts and pretend they were costumes, and they managed to find a way around that. I'm not suggesting that's what you should do, but I guess that takes us to the final section of this first part, is what we don't know. What we don't know is all of those little things, all those tips that people can pick up along the way, because of COVID, we haven't had the chance to take work to the EU yet. So there's a lot of things that we know in theory, but we don't know in practice. So sessions like today are very useful to share information. But I think what we all need to do now is just talk among each other and get some tips. The first people who are gonna tour to Europe I'm sure they will come back with lots of great insight and practical tips for us to use.
Great. I wonder if it's a good moment again just to switch interpreters. Thanks, everybody.
Brilliant. So yeah, just to give a quick case study of a UK company who was preparing for EU touring to look at some of this in action. We'll look at a performance called Roleplay by Simple Cypher. So this is Simple Cypher are a hip hop circus dance company. There's 3 UK artists living and working in the UK with British passports. We were preparing for performances in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, which was about a week of activity. They didn't go ahead due to COVID, but we did all the prep to, in theory, tour to perform these this summer. In terms of visas, it wasn't required in the Netherlands. So that was a kind of country-specific research. They didn't require visas. And equally, as we were only going for a short-term one-off engagement that didn't last more than 6 weeks, we didn't require work permits either. But this took a lot of back and forth to clarify with the festival. In terms of travel, we travel with costumes and props in hand luggage, so no carnet or no EORI number was required. We weren't selling merchandise either. And neither did any of our carry-on luggage look like we were traveling with commercial items. In terms of insurances, they all had their global health insurance cards. And then on top of that, I sourced travel insurance for entering into the Schengen area. And I guess a few considerations around that was we had to start keeping tracks on how many days artists have been in the EU and all of the EU Schengen area, just to make sure that no one was exceeding this 90 out of 180 day allowance. And that is for everything. It's for work that they're doing with other companies. It's for personal travel, essentially anything that's entering into the EU visa free within this visitor allowance counts towards your 90 days. So from a producing perspective, we're looking at trackers in terms of tracking the movement of all of our artists in and out of EU for our work and for other work and personal holidays. And then just as Axel's mentioned, this is the first time that festivals are also navigating these changes. So it was a kind of combined effort to try and understand, is this the right thing? Do we need anything else? So the run-in time was longer than previously, obviously when we were part of Europe. So just something to consider. Over to you, Axel, for inward mobility.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, so now we're moving on to the second part of this webinar. So inward mobility. So working with European citizens in the UK, and we're going to cover the same question. I'm also aware of time, so I'm going to speed through some of the answers because some of them are very technical, but we've got all the resources available. We talk about that in a minute. But so what has changed now that the UK has left the EU? Well, it's the same thing as same thing as before. So I'm getting mixed up now between UK and EU. But yeah, so the UK is a third country to the EU, so we lost a lot of rights, but we can still find ways to work with EU artists in the UK. So I'm going to talk about the 3 main ways that we know of to invite EU artists to work in the UK. So the first one is the permitted paid engagement that we also call PPE. And that's good for short-term contracts. So if you look at the rules, you can come to the UK on a permitted paid engagement if you are invited to by a UK organization. So that can be a venue, a festival, a registered company, or something like that. You come to the UK to do specific paid work, and you don't need to be sponsored via the point-based system. You need to be over 18. And very important, you visiting the UK for no more than 1 month. So the permitted paid engagement is only valid for 1 month to deliver a specific task, and then you go back home. So that can be useful for, let's say, a venue or a festival that invites a French company to perform. They can invite the company on a permitted paid engagements. That can also be useful for a UK company that works with Spanish dancers, and they invite them for a small tour in the UK or for 1 month or under a month R&D. One thing to note about the PPE is that for European citizens, you don't need like special paperwork for that. There's a list of documents that you need to provide on the government website. It's quite a long list, but there's no official paperwork. You need an invitation letter from the company that employs you. You need to prove that you're a recognized artist. If you come for a show, you need to show some marketing materials, but that's about the extent of it. So it's not too much hard work. But the one thing to bear in mind is that if a Spanish dancer come to the UK via Heathrow, let's say, or Eurostar or any airport actually, in theory, they can just go through the normal gates and enter the country, and they will be considered as a tourist, because European tourists can still come to the UK without any special paperwork. But if you come with the permitted paid engagements, you need to go through a separate gate where you're going to get a proper stamp on your passport that says that you are here in this country under a permitted paid engagements. And what that means is that the amount of time you spend in the UK won't be deducted from that 180-day allowance, which means that you can still come back in the UK for holiday and all that sort of things without being impacted. Okay, the next way to come to the UK for work is the skilled worker visa. So skilled worker visa is for people who plan on staying in the UK for a longer period of time. So they're valid for 5 years. Sorry, excuse me, yes. So getting confused with my notes. They're valid for 5 years, and there's a bunch of criteria. You need to have a salary of 25,600, or the specific going rates in your area. There's like a very, very long list of criteria that you should look on the government website. And the final way of getting work into the UK when you're from the EU is the Global Talent Visa. So that one is more specifically targeted at artists. It also covers people who work in academia and research or digital technology, but artists are included in that mix. So the difference between the Global Talent Visa and the Skilled Worker Visa is that your employers doesn't need to be a sponsor to grant you this visa. But what you need to have is a certification that you are exceptional, I guess, in your field. And for us in the arts, you need to get a recommendation from Arts Council England. So it's Arts Council England who will give the artist you want to work with this certificate. I guess that's what it's called. I'm aware that there are other ways to come to the UK for work, but I think they are more targeted at very, very special cases. So you can find more information about those.
Thanks, Axel. So then around considerations for changes for the transport of sets and equipment, these are the same considerations that we spoke about for a UK artist to travel to Europe. So if you're traveling with carry-on hand luggage, in general, that's fine. But as soon as you look at starting to transport a set or equipment with a vehicle, either that you're driving or that you're using courier services or hauliers for, you're looking at ATA carnets, which need to be applied for. In terms of what we don't know, it's really the same considerations. This is all, the information is out there, but we're just not aware of a lot of companies who have went through this process yet, and nor kind of accurately described how intensive that process was or how much workload that added on to their touring. So I think we're in a really crucial stage. Basically, COVID made us lose the transition year that we were supposed to have. So we're in a really important year of kind of sharing knowledge and practice with each other to understand what this looks like in reality. Axel, do you want to look at case study?
Yes, thank you, Kevin.
Lovely,
so a little case study. So we're going to look at the show Sigma by Gandini Juggling. So when I'm not at Split Second, I work for Gandini Juggling. I'm their international development manager and tour booker. So I had to think a lot about Brexit for them. So briefly about the show Sigma. So Sigma is a show performed by 4 artists. We have 1 English artist, 1 EU national living in the UK, and 2 EU nationals living in the EU. And our set is installed in France because we took so much in France that we left the set there. So what we need to do when we perform in the UK, that shows Sigma. So there's different things we need to look at. So obviously for the English artists, we don't have anything to do. We can just get a normal contract. For the EU artist that already lives in the UK, there's nothing special to do except that we need to make sure that this artist has the right to work in the UK so that they have their settled or pre-settled status. By the way, you only have until the end of the month, I think, to apply for your settled or pre-settled status if you're an EU citizen living here. So make sure that you do it, tell your friends so you can stay and work in this country. And the other people, the 2 EU nationals living in the EU. So from now on, when we're gonna perform Sigma in the UK, we're gonna provide them the documents so they can come to the UK, sorry, under permitted paid engagements. So what I was telling you about earlier, a letter of invitation, all the marketing tools, press clippings about the show, everything that proves that they come here for work and that they're gonna come back to their home country right after. And for the sets, so since the set is stored in France, so we need to organize freight and carnet. So to get the carnet, we're gonna talk to the French Chamber of Commerce, that's they deliver carnets, and get all the paperwork ready there and pay for the carnet in France. Get it stamped at the French border, get it stamped at the UK border, and then after the tour, send the sets back, and again get the carnet stamped at the UK border, at the French border, so that we don't have to pay taxes. In a nutshell, that's it for games and juggling.
Okay, great, thanks. And let's just swap over interpreters as well. Just take a moment to do that. Thank you.
Brilliant. So yeah, so we're just referring to a list of resources that we will be circulating, or I believe have already been circulated in the chat. But basically we've pulled together the sources that we've collated this information from. It's a real mix of places. Some of it's kind of government level guidance. Some of it's more practical, kind of translated for the arts sectors. Some are art form specific, like the research we've done for XTRAX and outdoor arts. But in reality, all this information is the same and kind of can be translated into the circumstance or the context that you're working in. So that will come out very soon. And then, Axel, should we skip on to Q&A for timing?
Yes, let's move on to Q&A.
Brilliant. So yeah, so we just wanted to kind of open the floor a little bit, I guess, to 2 things. One is we've identified that sharing practice and sharing our own experiences is super crucial at this time. So we're interested if anyone on the call has already been having discussions with EU festivals. Have you been preparing for EU touring, or vice versa? Or have you even presented work already? And is there anything you want to kind of feed into the discussion or share from your experience? If there's not, or in addition to that, what are the general questions that we're trying to understand? So maybe let's start with anyone who wants to share an experience. If you want to come on, unmute, make yourself known, come on chat.
I'm going to stop sharing now.
We've got a hand up from Mathieu. So yeah, let me just put you on. Thanks, Mathieu.
Hiya. Yeah, I just wanted to share a recent experience. We were talking about the A1 and about the nightmare of the A1. I have recently worked in Italy. So I have a settled status in the UK. And in order to not go through this whole problem of taxes, I've been asked to provide a certificate of residence from the HMRC, which then the employer could give to the tax authority in Italy in order to prove that I was resident and paying my taxes in Britain. And I have to say that was quite straightforward and quite easy to get from HMRC in order to communicate to my employer. So that was the first time I encountered this way of doing things. And I don't know whether that's a different way or whether, but what's for sure is that it's an easier way than the A1.
Thank you. That's great to know. I wasn't aware of that. That's really good to know. Thanks.
Brilliant. Anyone else? Has anyone been preparing to tour work? Has anyone got their head around carnets, applied for visas, all that sort of stuff, and wants to feed into the discussion what that process was like? I'm thinking workload, is your administrative systems changed? Like, I see a few people nodding, but it's obviously if you want to come on.
Well, maybe we can also move on to some general questions, if that's useful.
I guess, maybe I just say on kind of solutions and changes to administrative systems, part of the guide that we keep referring to from XTRAX was a series of case studies from 7 companies who were kind of sharing how their administrative practices were changing, and also how their future creation processes may be influenced by some of these new processes. So it's just worth reading that to hear how companies are adapting. But Amy, I'll let you fire on.
That's great. Well, we've got a couple of hands up, so maybe we'll go to those first, Hannah and Rhea. And I've also got a handful of questions. So let's see if we can get through those before the end of the session. So Hannah, I'm just going to add you on this if you want to add your thought or question.
Hello, I work with a couple of artists as a producer, and I also advise people on international working as well. Met you before, Axel, crying out loud, hello. The artists I work with, they actually hired a specific person 2 days a week to manage their touring in Europe, because it's such a big part of their work. And they've just gone to France to do some work there. And the only thing I would say is that we were so glad that we did hire that extra person, because it was really stressful trying to navigate COVID restrictions, which is constantly changing at the moment. All of the extra work. One of our artists is European and has a settled status in Britain as well, so there's an extra layer of complication there as well. But I would highly advise hiring people if you can, extra people if you can, for more support.
Can I ask a question on that? And like from a financial perspective, are you in a position where you've got reserves to just bring in extra staff, or is that impacted on your touring costs? Like, what's the kind of, how are you approaching the management of that?
Well, we had, we've been planning for this for a while because of kind of Brexit. So we had already raised some money for that person, but we also started to increase our fees to pay for that extra support, so we can kind of add that management cost into every single fee now.
Yeah, and I get, that's a great practical advice. And this came up again through case studies that we've done, where people were looking at trying to spread those costs over a whole tour, rather than, some festivals maybe paying more, some standard fees, but looking at, a touring season and trying to cover those costs over that period of time. But yeah, great. Yeah. Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. So I'm just going to bring in Rhea now. So I don't know if you want to shoot with your question or thought, Rhea.
Hello. It's a question. It's more, I'm not, I work in collaboration with another artist. She is British, and I myself have dual citizenship. And we're not at the stage ready for touring work, but we're making work in Spain at the moment. We have resident artists at a couple of institutions in Spain. So just wondering if any of these, if there's different rules that apply for when you're making rather than touring, or if it's the same process.
It's it's the same process. Brexit applies to work. It doesn't really care what type of work it is. So yeah. But yeah, if you look into all the resources, you will find some like explanation of how things work for Spain, specifically for Spain. So you can look into that and see what sort of visa or what permits you need. If you need.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, Lorraine. That's a great question. So yeah, should we move into some of the more general questions or questions that people have brought up before? Let's see if we can whip through them. So one person asked, when talking about a work permit, is it only if the contract is between you and a Schengen area organization? What happens if you are contracted by a British company to work abroad?
This is a very tricky question to answer. I feel like to answer this question properly, we probably need a bit more information. Because often what I imagine is that there will be a local employer at some point in that chain. Maybe you as an individual is employed by a British company, but the British company is in contracts with a French or whatever company. So yes, you will need more permits.
And I would say that
your direct employer is British. Sorry.
Yeah, I'd say even if you're a company subcontracting artists to send out, like, it's fairly standard in the contract between presenter and company that it's company's responsibility to have the right permits, visas, license, and like generally the company's signing in to agree with that. You know, in practicality, what's been looked at borders, if you're traveling with a backpack to go in to do R&D for a week, who knows? But, you know, legally in a contract, this is outlined that company is responsible for providing the right documentation and sourcing.
Yeah.
So absolutely.
Yeah, that sounds like a good guideline. Okay, I'm sure there's more to unravel with that, but let's move on to another question. Someone said, we work with artists who are resident in the UK, they have settled status, but still hold EU passports. I think that means they're free to work across the EU permit free. Is that correct? Yes. So that's really good news for those people who got the best of both worlds there. So that's really good. It's good to clarify these things sometimes, isn't it?
Hence the influx of Irish citizenship pre-Brexit. Amazing.
If I could, I would, but sadly not. So a question about PPD. Is it 30 days from the first day of your employment, or is it 30 days in the total of your employment days? So thinking about a spread of performance date and a tour, for example, where you may have some days in between where you're not working officially.
I can answer that one, Kevin. So just to be sure, it's PPE, not PPD, just to avoid confusion. So it's permitted paid engagement. Maybe just a typo, but just in case. So no, PPE are valid for 30 days in total. It's not the number of working days, it's the number of days you spend in the country. Actually, I didn't mention that when I was talking earlier, but when you go to the border with all your paperwork and files, you need to show your return tickets, you need to show your accommodation. So you really need to prove that within 30 days you would have left the country. So yeah, you can't really spread, they can't cover a tour that's spread across 2 months.
Okay, that's good to know. And then the last question that I've got here from the chat, we're doing quite well getting through these. Is there a fee for the paid permitted engagements entry? I think that came in the bit where we were talking about people coming into the UK. So is there a fee for that?
No, they're free because you don't need special paperwork. It's all information that you already have that you need to put together yourself. That being said, PPE is also valid for people coming from outside of the EU, but they need a visa. So in that case, the PPE visa is not free. I don't think it costs a lot, but it's not free. It's just for EU citizens who can come to the UK as tourists with that visa.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's clear. Oh, someone's put in here, it costs around £95 for that.
Exactly.
Jess Greer, colleague at the place. Very good. Yeah, great. So I wonder if we might start wrapping it up. I don't know if anybody's got any more burning questions. Now is the time. So either raise your hand or yes, Mathieu's got another one. Go for it.
I'm so sorry. So it's about the sponsorship. So I suppose a company, it's not I suppose, is I've understood a company has to be certified in order to be a sponsorship company or a company that can deliver sponsorship. My first question is, how do you get that? And therefore, if you can't get it, can you partner with another organization who would have this certification in order to sponsor an artist coming from abroad?
I can try to answer, Kevin. So the process to become a sponsor, again, sorry, but it's explained in the guide. So you can look in the guide, it explains how you can become a sponsor. I think it's quite labor intensive and it's expensive as well. I think it depends on your turnover and how many licenses you want, if I remember correctly. But that's a few £1,000 depending on scale. And yes, of course, if you're not a sponsor yourself, you can partner with an organization who is sponsored and can deliver visas on your behalf.
I think one of the considerations, I'm trying to find a link to paste you around becoming a sponsor, but one of the considerations is that you have the right accounting and kind of management systems to legally be keeping on top of certificates that you're issuing. So like with becoming a sponsor, you are legally certifying people to come into the country. So there comes a kind of a legal and an administrative responsibility that comes with that. I will try and find it really quick whilst we're wrapping up to paste into the chat for you.
Thank you very much.
And also, just to say, just in case, but yeah, so for the PPE, you don't need to be a sponsor, and for the talent visa, you also don't need to be a sponsor. It's for the other one, the skilled worker visa. You need to be a sponsor.
So how can I make a difference in between whether I need for an artist a skilled worker visa or a global talent visa? How will I know that? Which visa is the most valid to a situation?
I think the best way would be to actually call HMRC. They're very good on the phone with that sort of things. I had to call them many times for visas in the past, and they're very, very helpful. There must be some like very subtle differences between one or the other or the type of job that only them will know.
Okay.
And also,
great.
I think maybe in how they present it, that maybe the talent visa is good for artists, and I always get the name wrong, the skilled worker visa might be more suitable for technicians or producers, the more off-stage side of things.
Okay, great, thank you. Just one little comment there from Jess Greer, who manages the theatre programme at the place. It's important to note that a sponsor organisation can only sponsor performances that are happening with them. They can't sponsor performances across a whole tour. So that's probably useful to know as well. Great. Gosh, it's been quite it's been like a boom, boom, boom of lots of information, but hopefully that's been really useful for everybody. I've certainly learned a lot. So before we go, just make sure that you get to the chat that resource pack. We will email that to you in case you've missed it or you can't download it. We'll email that to you. I'm also dropping in here just right now in the chat the rest of the webinar. So these continue next week. We've got one with Louise Cattarega, I'm just writing in the spelling for you there, Louise Cattarega on Monday, which is all about the ethics of participatory dance. And then on Wednesday, we've got one with Stuart Hayes from Fuel on green practice. So all that's left for me, I think, to say at this time is a massive thank you to everyone. Thanks for everyone who came along and listened, and for all your attention and questions. Thank you to Stacey and Erin for your interpretation, and a massive thank you to Kevin and Axel for that whistle-stop tour of excellent information. So thanks very much for that.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, and take good care. See you soon, I hope. Bye. Bye.